Hello. I am so glad to see you. Have you read the book? Have you read the book? I hope you have, because this is an absolutely cracking book. The History of Tom Jones, a Foundling, by Henry Fielding. So this book really rather explains why we are the Georgian book club as opposed to a Victorian book club. Because Tom Jones fornicates his way across England. There's a lot of that F word in this book, a lot of it, and a lot of fun with it. This is not a censorious form of fornication. There is no great moral at the end of Fielding's work. What we have is bawdy, ribald fun, which should be the other F word best associated with this book. Now, in Victorian literature, the great prudes, fornicating generally leads to death, dishonour, or exile. All a little boring, if you ask me. Okay, maybe we took it a little too far, but still. Tom Jones manages to fornicate his way across England for much of the book with no dire moral, life-impeding consequences for anyone involved in said fornication. In fact, Tom is one of the most amiable, warm, lovable characters in all of Georgian literature, and perhaps even all of literature. He is a lovely, lovely boy. A very lovely, lovely boy. And so can you really blame the ladies for deciding that they would like to take this lovely, lovely boy to bed when the opportunity arises? And that is one of the big things about Tom Jones, is that the fornication is entirely mutual and generally instigated by the ladies. They see what they like and they take it. Now, to understand why Tom Jones is like this, one needs to also have a look at what else was happening at the same time, and also have a look at who he was hanging around with. Now, the novelist Richardson had written the book Pamela. Pamela is all about a servant girl who makes an attempt to both retain her chastity and win the gentleman of the house's hand in marriage, which she does manage to do. I don't know how, she really doesn't put out. He spends a lot of time assailing her virtue and she spends a lot of time defending her virtue. Now, Fielding satirised this in two works, Shamala and Joseph Andrews. Joseph Andrews, quite interestingly, because he inverts the paradigm of a male master and a female servant. In Joseph Andrews, who is supposedly the brother of Pamela, we get a male servant and a seductress in the form of his mistress, who would like to assail his virtue. Now, Richardson then went on to write Clarissa, great big fat book told in letters. Don't think we're going to do Clarissa because it really is very long. And I'm not terribly fond of Richardson. I'd much rather read Fielding any day. But Clarissa is pursued and raped and dies by a gentleman named Lovelace, who's a seducer. Now, Fielding read Clarissa. Fielding had read Clarissa and actually wrote to Richardson and begged him not to kill Clarissa. So there's a thought. Fielding is not puritanical. He's not prudent. He's not a prude. He is a man who initially began writing for the theatre and then turned to novels when the laws turned against him in terms of his content in the theatre being a little too political. He was also a lawyer and justice of the peace and put in a certain degree of the framework for the modern police force. So, interesting. But what makes him also interesting is he is a contemporary and admires Swift. And his novel Tom Jones sits in between the two novels that we have already looked at. On one hand, Swift's Gulliver's Travels, and on the other, Lawrence Sterne and his Tristram Shandy, which is what is called a sentimental novel. Now, Fielding's Tom Jones is known as a picaresque, and it's a comedy. And one of the things that Fielding does do, which is quite unique, is he inserts himself into the novel. So whereas Swift is quite happy to give authorial content over to Gulliver, forgot his name there for a moment, and Sterne is quite happy to give authorial control over to Tristram, Fielding retains that theatrical control. He is the director. He is the puppet master of these characters. He's actually, you will find something similar if you go into the 19th century and you look at Thackeray and Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair seeming to have some parallels with Tom Jones in this regard. But Tom Jones is very much a novel. It's very constructed. It is a picaresque, and a picaresque is generally considered a quasi-early novel. So, for instance, Gulliver's Travels is a picaresque. If you take one or two of the incidents out, it's not going to really affect the overall arc of the story. Things happen, but there isn't a lot of causal linkages in it. So that's what a picaresque is. A novel has causal linkages. If you start pulling threads out of something like Tristram Shandy, what happens is you will end up destabilizing and unraveling the whole work. Tom Jones sort of does sit somewhere in between these two ideas. It is a picaresque, as in it's a lot of little adventures. However, there is causal linkages. These adventures occur because of things that have happened before. The story is resolved because of things that have happened, not just, oh, well, I got home, like in Gulliver. So there is that to it. You are starting to get that causal linkages, but you also have this really strong narrator. This really, really strong narrator who comes in and basically says, this is my story. And these are some of the funniest parts of the book. These introductions to each book of the novel are Henry Fielding himself railing, absolutely railing against the critic, because he talks about the novel as being like a bill of fare at a pub or a hotel, where you could eat whatever you wanted in your own home, but in a hotel the hotelier is going to give you a bill of fare, laying out the dishes that you can select from. And this is what a novelist does. He lays out the story as he sees fit. And this is the only option. He also rails against the critic as being a great slanderer and a killer of children, being that the novel is the writer's intellectual child. And so it is a very funny thing. It's also very, very constructed and theatrical construction. Very much its comedic construction does have a debt to the theatre, which was where Fielding started his writing, is in the theatre. So he uses a lot of what were, for his audience, very, very well-known tropes, coincidences, overheard conversations, misunderstandings, miscommunications, these sorts of things that are then all solved in the end of the novel, are all theatrical tropes that were very, very used and understood by the audience of his day. Fielding is not interested in morality as such, in the idea that particular sets of behaviour can determine whether you are a good person, and that good people are not strictly tied to a particular class. That is the other thing, is Fielding is of the minor gentry. He actually is a titled individual. So unlike most of the writers who are writing about people who are above them, the world of Squire Allworthy and Squire Weston is actually a world that he understands. It's a world that he knows well. He knows who your betters are and how to write them. So he is definitely not the grocer with a pen that you may find Defoe being satirised as by Swift. So he is very interested in the fact that goodness is something that's inherent. In fact, it's something that Bridget Allworthy tells Tom, that it's not enough that your actions are good. You must also seem to be good. And this warm character, this warm, generous, open character, this is what he learns throughout his whole long, picaresque, fornicating journey around England, is he learns how to make sure that he doesn't just be good, but he appears good. So it's about the idea that goodness is something inherent in people, something that should really drive you. Because there are characters, he satirises a great many characters. There is the Reverend Thwackum, and there is his counterpart, Square. And both of them, the philosopher, and both of them would kill half the world for their own good, but they'd kill the opposite half to the other. So these are the overzealous, really morally upright, prudent men. So he likes to satirise them. He likes to satirise someone like Bliffle, the bad character, who is utterly cold. He has all the appeal. If Tom is warm and lovely and lovable, Bliffle has all the appeal of a dead fish. So Tom Jones, have a read of it. It is a wonderful, wonderful book. You will not regret it. Time spent with Tom is never regretted. Ask many of the ladies. It's a story about growing up. It's a story about good natures prevailing in the end. And one doesn't suggest that Tom repents. There is no Richardson repentance at the end of Tom Jones. Tom Jones merely grows up. He marries his sweetheart, and he works out that what he had been doing while adventuring is no longer appropriate. He will take his place in society. He will forever be an amiable young man, an amiable middle-aged man, and a sweet-tempered old man, just as his adopted father, Squire Allworthy, was. He has no need for any great moral redemption because he's good. Now, Mr. Blithell, on the other hand, he needs some moral redemption. He needs a bit of warming up, maybe a hot pan, a bit of butter. So that is Tom Jones. I hope you enjoyed it. And next month, we're going to hear from one of the ladies. We're going to hear from a very famous lady, a very obscure work by a very famous lady. In fact, it's two works because they're both very, very short. We are going to read Mary and the Wrongs of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, who is more famous for writing her piece, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which makes her really the beginning of the feminist movement. So we're going to look at her. Two novels, very short novels. Of course, remembering her daughter is also an exceptionally famous novelist. But more of that anon. And I will see you at the beginning of, well, actually, let's make it the end of October. I'll see you at the end of October because they're very short little books. And until we meet again, farewell.